The Cold War from the American Perspective. From the American perspective, the Cold War was a long twilight struggle that defined U.S. foreign and domestic policy from the mid-1940s through the early 1990s. It began in the aftermath of World War II, when the United States emerged as a global superpower and rivaled the Soviet Union for influence, security, and ideological dominance. Unlike previous wars, the Cold War involved no direct, large-scale military clash between the two main adversaries. Instead, it unfolded through arms races, proxy wars, political crises, economic competition, and intense ideological confrontation. For Americans, the Cold War shaped how they understood their country's role in the world, influenced everyday life, and left legacies that still inform U.S. policy. Origins. From World War II, Alliance to Superpower Rivalry. At the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were formally allies, but their relationship quickly deteriorated. American leaders saw Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe, installing communist governments and limiting political freedoms, as evidence of expansionist intentions that threatened a post-war order based on self-determination and open markets. The Soviets, in turn, viewed U.S. economic and military power, including the atomic bomb, as potential instruments of coercion. From Washington's vantage point, preventing another catastrophic war and avoiding depression meant building a stable international system. The U.S. championed institutions like the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank, and promoted European economic recovery through the Marshall Plan. At the same time, concerns about Soviet influence led to a shift from cooperative wartime diplomacy to a strategy of containment. George F. Kennan's 1947 Long Telegram and subsequent writings articulated the intellectual basis for containment, the idea that the U.S. should limit Soviet expansion through political, economic, and, where necessary, military means, while avoiding direct war. The Truman Doctrine, first applied in Greece and Turkey, declared that the U.S. would support free peoples resisting armed minorities or outside pressures, signaling a global commitment to oppose perceived communist advances. From an American perspective, Europe was the central theater of the early Cold War. The Berlin blockade of 1948-49, when the Soviets cut land access to West Berlin, intensified fears of aggressive Soviet tactics. The U.S. led Berlin airlift, supplying the city by air for nearly a year, showcased American resolve and technological capacity. In 1949, the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, institutionalized U.S. security commitments to Western Europe. For Americans, NATO represented a historic departure from pre-World War II isolationism, a peacetime alliance designed to deter Soviet attack and reassure allies. U.S. troops remained stationed in Europe, and American policymakers saw the transatlantic partnership as essential to both European stability and U.S. security. Domestically, early Cold War tensions contributed to anti-communist sentiment and McCarthyism. Fear of Soviet espionage and internal subversion led to loyalty oaths, investigations, and blacklists. For many Americans, the Cold War was not only an external geopolitical struggle, but also an internal battle over ideology and loyalty. For the United States, the Cold War quickly expanded beyond Europe. The communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 underscored the perceived global nature of the threat. The Korean War, where U.S.-led UN forces fought North Korean and Chinese troops, convinced American leaders that military confrontation with communist governments was a real and recurring possibility. Subsequent crises reinforced this global view. The Eisenhower Doctrine extended U.S. security commitments to the Middle East, linking the region's strategic importance to Cold War competition. In Latin America, the U.S. backed anti-communist regimes and sometimes supported covert operations to influence political outcomes, reflecting a belief that even small states mattered in the ideological balance. From the American perspective, this worldwide posture was justified by the need to prevent a shift in the balance of power. Critics, however, argued that it sometimes led to support for authoritarian regimes and intervention in local conflicts that were only partially related to the Soviet rivalry. One of the defining features of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, ending the U.S. nuclear monopoly. Both sides then developed more powerful thermonuclear weapons, along with long-range bombers, submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. From an American strategic standpoint, nuclear weapons were both a deterrent and a danger. Policies such as massive retaliation in the 1950s promised overwhelming nuclear response to aggression, aiming to deter Soviet moves but also raising concerns about accidental or escalatory war. Later, doctrines evolved toward flexible response, emphasizing a wide range of options. Arms control became a key element of U.S. policy. Treaties like the Limited Test Ban Treaty, 1963, SALT agreements in the 1970s, and other measures sought to manage the arms race and reduce risks even as competition continued. For Americans, living under the shadow of potential nuclear conflict in drills, public culture, and policy debates was a defining psychological aspect of the Cold War. Domestically, the Cold War profoundly shaped American life. On one hand, defense spending fueled research, technological innovation, and economic growth. The military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower warned, became a powerful and permanent part of the economy and political system. On the other hand, anti-communism shaped politics and culture. Loyalty programs, congressional investigations, and prosecutions targeted suspected communists and sympathizers. Hollywood, universities, and labor unions faced scrutiny. While many Americans accepted these measures as necessary for national security, others saw them as infringements on civil liberties. The Cold War also influenced education and science policy. The launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957, for example, spurred U.S. investment in science and math education and in space exploration, culminating in the Apollo moon landings. This space race was about prestige and technological leadership as much as scientific progress. Culturally, the U.S. promoted its own model of modernity, consumer abundance, individual freedom, and democratic institutions as an implicit and sometimes explicit contrast to Soviet socialism. American music, films, and popular culture became unofficial tools of influence abroad. Several Cold War crises tested American leadership and brought the world close to catastrophe. The Berlin crises, including the 1961 construction of the Berlin Wall, symbolized the division of Europe and prompted U.S. vows to defend West Berlin. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was perhaps the most dangerous moment. When U.S. reconnaissance discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval quarantine and demanded their removal. From the American vantage point, the crisis was resolved successfully when the Soviets agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for U.S. commitments regarding Cuba and the quiet removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. The episode underscored the need for direct communication and crisis management mechanisms, leading to the establishment of a hotline between Washington and Moscow. Vietnam represented the most costly and divisive Cold War conflict for the United States. Seeking to contain communism in Southeast Asia, successive administrations escalated involvement, leading to a protracted war that deeply polarized American society and ended without achieving its strategic goals. From an American perspective, Vietnam challenged assumptions about the effectiveness of military power, the validity of the domino theory in all contexts, and the importance of public support in sustaining long conflicts. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, American leaders recognized that perpetual confrontation carried great risks and costs. Under Presidents Nixon and Ford, the U.S. pursued Détente, an effort to ease tensions with the Soviet Union while still competing globally. Key aspects of Détente included strategic arms, limitation talks, SALT, trade agreements, and diplomatic engagement. Importantly, the U.S. also opened relations with the People's Republic of China, exploiting Sino-Soviet rivalries to gain leverage and reshape the global strategic triangle. From the American perspective, Détente was pragmatic. It accepted that the Soviet Union would remain a rival, but sought to stabilize the relationship and prevent nuclear war. Critics, however, worried that Détente might signal weakness or allow the Soviets to make gains in the Third World, and debates over Détente became a central theme in U.S. politics. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Cold War entered a renewed phase of tension. Events such as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the Iranian Revolution, limiting U.S. influence in the Middle East, contributed to a perception in Washington that Soviet expansionism was resurgent. Under President Ronald Reagan, U.S. rhetoric hardened and military spending increased significantly. Reagan labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire and pursued programs like the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, intended to develop missile defense systems. At the same time, the U.S. supported anti-communist movements and insurgencies in various regions, from Central America to Afghanistan, as part of a renewed effort to roll back Soviet influence. However, the late Cold War also saw renewed arms control and diplomatic engagement, especially after Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union in 1985. Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, and willingness to negotiate allowed U.S.-Soviet relations to improve. Agreements such as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF, Treaty marked real progress in reducing nuclear arsenals. From the American perspective, Reagan's combination of pressure and negotiation, along with structural weaknesses in the Soviet system, contributed to a shift in the balance. U.S. leaders increasingly believed that the Cold War could end not just in stalemate, but in Western victory. Between 1989 and 1991, a series of dramatic events transformed the international landscape: the fall of the Berlin Wall, democratic revolutions in Eastern Europe, German reunification, and ultimately the dissolution of the Soviet Union. For Americans, these events were widely interpreted as a triumph of liberal democracy and market capitalism over Soviet-style communism. From Washington's perspective, U.S. policies of containment, alliance building, economic strength, and ideological appeal had ultimately succeeded in outlasting and outcompeting the Soviet system. The end of the Cold War seemed to vindicate decades of investment in security commitments and global leadership. Yet the conclusion of the Cold War also raised new questions. Without a single overarching adversary, what should guide U.S. foreign policy? How should America balance its power with international institutions and norms it had helped create? These debates would shape the post-Cold War era, from interventions in the Balkans to the War on Terror. At home, the Cold War left deep institutional and cultural legacies. The national security state, comprising the Pentagon, intelligence agencies, and sprawling defense industries, remained central to U.S. governance. Defense spending and global military presence continued, albeit at reduced levels compared to the peak of superpower confrontation. The Cold War also influenced American political ideology. Commitment to a liberal international order based on alliances, open markets, and Multilateral institutions became a core element of mainstream U.S. foreign policy thinking. At the same time, memories of Vietnam and other interventions kept alive concerns about overreach. Culturally, the Cold War permeated film, literature, and public consciousness, from spy novels and movies about nuclear war to debates over civil liberties and dissent. The experience of living under the threat of nuclear annihilation, while never realized, formed part of the psychological backdrop for several generations of Americans. From the American perspective, the Cold War was a defining era, a global multi-decade contest that shaped institutions, policies, and identities. It began as a response to perceived Soviet expansion and ideology, developed through a complex mix of confrontation and cooperation, and ended with the dramatic collapse of the rival system. Along the way, it pushed the United States into unprecedented global leadership, created powerful domestic structures, and left a lasting imprint on how Americans think about security, freedom, and their country's role in the world. Even after its formal end, the Cold War continues to influence U.S. debates about alliances, military spending, democracy promotion, and relations with Russia and China. In that sense, understanding the Cold War from the American point of view remains vital for grasping both past choices and current challenges.